Well, welcome to Check Up with Dr. Mark, and I'm here today with Dr. Sam Rima. He is the author of Overcoming the Dark Side of Leadership. Great book. I recommend it. It's a book I've used for years, and also Dr. Rima he was my doctoral advisor at Bethel University over 10 years ago. Wow, it's been a long time, Sam. But now today, I'll have Sam introduce his role in his new role there in Spokane, Washington. And Sam, tell us more about yourself. And today we're going to talk about, everybody, the 5 dark sides of leadership, as it also involves the 5 dark sides of just being human and how we can apply that into our recovery process and how we can work through the issues that we all have. And with God's help, move forward. But Sam, tell us more about yourself as far as today, and more about the 5 dark sides.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm, as you said, I have been a pastor and professor for about 35, 36 years, and then also an executive minister with our denomination, which was the Baptist General Conference, is now Converge Worldwide. For about 10 years, I directed the Doctor of Ministry program at Bethel University and Seminary, and also taught in the Center for Transformational Leadership. And even while I was at Bethel, I served 2 different intentional interims as senior pastor in Minnesota, one in a Baptist church in Cambridge, Minnesota for 2 years, and another for an evangelical free church, Wyzetta Evangelical Free Church there in the Twin Cities area. So spent a lot of time in the Twin Cities. Been married to my wife, Sue, for 38 years. Coming up in August, it'll be 39 years. We have 4 adult children, 2 girls, 2 boys, 7 grandchildren, all girls, except for 1 boy.
Okay.
And so he gets a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And we've got 1 on the way, and that's a girl on the way as well. So I don't know what it is in our gene pool, but we are blessed with a lot of little ladies in our family and enjoying that immensely. They mostly live right around us within 15 to 20 minutes away. So that's been a real blessing. Right now I'm serving at an organization called Partners International. It's a 75-year-old organization that works primarily with Indigenous ministry partners in the 1040 window. We exclusively work with unreached people groups. So an unreached people group is a group that has less than 2% of its population who knows Christ, or it isn't able to sustain any kind of evangelistic outreach on its own because of just the lack of Christian influence. And in most of those places where we work, it's actually either illegal to be a believer or it's illegal to convert to Christianity. And there are a lot of anti-blasphemy laws and very oppressive governments and that thing who, actually monitor the internet and monitor email. So we have to be very careful. A lot of the people we work with use synonyms and that kind of thing. So it's been an exciting journey, and throughout that journey, when I was about, 32 years old, pastoring my second church, which was a church plant in Southern California. We started with about 15 people in a living room, and the church rapidly grew over the next few years to about 800 people. And I found myself really over my head in terms of just my emotional capacity, my spiritual capacity. The ministry had really outgrown my ability to lead it well. And it was during that time that I really kind of had, I don't know if I'd call it an emotional breakdown, but definitely had an existential crisis where I just didn't feel like no matter what I did, it wasn't good enough. I wasn't doing enough of it. I was leading 2 Bible studies a night, about 3 nights a week. And just feeling just absolutely overwhelmed to the point that I remember going to my board chairman and in tears saying, I've got to quit. I just can't do this anymore. It's just killing me. And I told my wife one day in the car, I said, I quit, I'm done, I can't do this. And it just came very abruptly. I hadn't shared anything previously really with how I was struggling, but it just kind of exploded on me like these waves crashing in. And I just felt like I was hopeless, that I couldn't see the way forward. And I didn't know what this emotional onslaught was. And that's really what prompted me to begin doing some inner work and begin doing some reading. I actually was granted a leave for a couple of weeks from my church and sent to another pastor who had a similar experience, was about 15 years older than me. So I went and spent 2 weeks in Orlando, Florida with him, and kind of he began to walk me through this journey of beginning to really, for the first time in my life, experience the love and the grace of God. I don't know if you're familiar with the Enneagram.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, which is an achiever. And who always needs to achieve and is very performance-based kind of personality. And the root sin of an achiever is deception. So one of the things that I've always struggled with is deception, in the sense that I'm not going to let anyone see me sweat, in a sense. I'm just going to work as hard as I can. Everything's always okay. I'm always on top of the world until I'm not, until I crash and burn. And then I don't know what in the world to do. So that was a journey that took place, that was probably about 1991. So that was a long time ago. And it's been a learning journey ever since. But that was really what precipitated my interest in what was going on inside of me. It also kind of happened at the same time as we saw these televangelists falling. Some of your listeners or audience might not remember, like we do, when some of these Jim Bakker and Jimmy Swaggart had these just high-profile crashes of their ministries. And so I was wondering, here are guys that obviously love God. They went into ministry to help people and to serve Jesus and share the gospel. And yet, for whatever reason, at the pinnacle of their success, they absolutely crashed and burned. And there was a lot of self-defeating behaviors that led to that. And so as I was kind of looking at my life and what I was going through, and at the same time watching this on the news, began to wonder if there was something in common, if there was some kind of phenomena in leadership, particularly, I guess, in people who desire leadership that can cause those kinds of problems. So that kind of precipitated my own doctoral research for my first doctorate, and which ultimately was a study on the dark side of leadership, or the shadow side. So that's a little bit about me and how I got to where I am and how I wrote the book.
Sure. And as you came to identify the 5 dark sides, that has been very helpful for me as well in my study, and also my life included. But as we look at the 12 steps of recovery, how would you, bridge over these 5 dark sides? Well, in fact, let's identify what the 5 dark sides are. Let's just start out there, and let's then bridge them over into the 12 steps of recovery, which, of course, we have come from most of the time, and wed them together.
Okay. Yeah, well, first of all, just kind of a definition of the dark side.
Sure.
The dark side is also often called the shadow side, which was Carl Jung's kind of description of the dark side. We also call it the false self. And so what the false self or the dark side is a persona that we create, that we present to the world around us. And it's a persona that we create to protect ourselves from our own sense of vulnerability, shame, guilt, pain, inadequacy. And so we kind of present this persona to the world around us as a way of kind of, hiding, in a sense, our true self, because we don't feel adequate or loved. And for everyone, it's different. But the shapes that our dark side takes is really dependent on the experiences we have during childhood and our developmental years and our family of origin, particularly. And a lot of it is, tied to our particular personality type in terms of what shape our dark side will take. But there are 5 primary shapes. And the first is narcissistic. And then there's compulsive dark side. There's paranoid, passive aggressive, and codependent.
Yes.
And obviously there are other ways that our false self can manifest itself. But as I was doing my research, these are the 5 kind of predominant ways that we manifest our shadow self, our false self to the world around us.
Sure. So as we look at the 5, especially with codependency, which is a popular topic, and by the way, everybody, compulsive dark side or shadow side refers to control, control issues, and we all know that. being overly controlling and trying to be in control of everything around us when we really aren't. In addition to that, just the codependency of the dysfunctional relationship we have with other people, and trying to fix everybody else except, at the expense of ourselves. And so with the 12 steps of recovery, how do you see these 12 steps entering into managing the 12 or the 5 dark sides?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of parallel with the 12 steps and what I advocate for the steps in overcoming our dark side. Really, the 5 different shapes our dark side takes are really the ways that we particularly compensate for our unique brokenness and sense of inadequacy, sense of not being enough, whatever it is. And so oftentimes, one of the things that our dark side can also lead to is addiction issues. Mm-hmm. There's a great book by Gerald May called Addiction and Grace. Yeah. And the whole idea is that oftentimes we become so attached to these ways of being in the world and hiding our true self from others, because we feel like if people really knew who I was, mm-hmm. and what I did, what I thought, the areas I struggle with sin, yeah. no one would respect me, they wouldn't love me. And I think that's particularly acute for people in positions of leadership, particularly pastors, because yeah. oftentimes pastors have nowhere to go to share what they're struggling with. And so oftentimes the dark side is a form of addiction, really, whether it's our narcissism or our codependence or our compulsive or passive aggressive behavior or paranoia. And so really, when you look at the 12 steps, much of the 12 steps are all about self-awareness. Mm-hmm. It's about admitting that we have a problem. It's recognizing that there's something that we can't control in and of ourselves and that is doing harm to us and to others. And so there's a lot of parallel there in the sense that really the first step to overcoming our dark side, much like the first of the 12 steps, is admitting we have one and recognizing, yes, I probably have a narcissistic shadow side to my personality that's negatively impacting those around me. Now, the interesting thing about our dark side is often we're so deep in denial and it becomes such a normal part of our daily behavior and the persona that we've created over time that we don't see it in ourselves. But everyone around us sees it first or recognize it, much like those who are stuck in addiction. People who are stuck in addiction, it's often the people around them that end up compensating for their behavior through what we call codependents. And, they become dependent on the dependent person for how they act to try to protect the family unit or whatever it is. And so oftentimes, our dark side is just another form of addiction, but oftentimes it can also be accompanied by actual chemical addiction to alcohol or drugs or pornography or other behaviors that are unhealthy because, we don't know what to do with this. And because we're kind of in denial, living out of this dark side, there's so much internal pressure and incongruity in our lives that we need to self-medicate just the constant pain, the constant sense of, not being able to live out of our true self. And so oftentimes people, even in ministry and leadership, turn to, some self-medicating behaviors like drugs or alcohol or pornography or other things. So.
Yeah. And in the book, everybody, if you buy the book online on Amazon, the Overcoming the Dark Side of Leadership, which has some great appendices, some great additions to it. Dr. Rima has some great inventories in the back. In fact, explain what the inventory for the dark side helps us to do.
Yeah, the inventory basically is an inventory of your dark side. So if you're honest and you take this inventory, you will see the shape that your particular dark side has taken. And oftentimes I encourage people to take it for themselves and then have their spouse or a very close colleague who they trust take it for them. Mm-hmm. So that you kind of get this, this crossover to where you can see, this is how I feel. And yes, this is what other people see in me as well. And yeah, there's the inventory in the back of the book that you can take. You can also go to our website, which is scmli.com,
Mhm.
scmli.com, Spiritual Capital and Moral Leadership Institute. And there's an online profile there that you can take for free that will tell you what your dark side is.
Wonderful. That's great to know. Repeat it one more time.
scmli.com.
Perfect. And given that, now with each dark side, there are challenges and there are recommendations. And you
Right.
could just highlight a few of those. That'd be great under each category for us.
Yeah. I think one of the most predominant dark side issues for people in leadership, whether it's pastoral leadership or other forms of leadership, would be narcissism.
Mhm.
A lot of people feel like narcissists have this inflated ego and this expansive uh, feeling about who they are and their sense of entitlement. But
Mhm.
at the root of narcissism is extremely low self-image and, in fact, self-loathing. They feel completely inadequate. They feel like they don't measure up. Oftentimes, they've been in a family of origin situation where they had an older brother or sibling that they could never measure up to,
Mhm.
or they had maybe perfectionistic parents or very demanding parents who always required them to do everything right. And so, for the narcissist, what they do to compensate for this sense of inadequacy and fear of not being enough is they project this image of being this bigger than life character and never being wrong and always being right and everything's the biggest and the best and the greatest and and that kind of thing. And so again, the biggest challenge for the narcissist, and I found in my experience that it's often one of the most difficult for people to admit to, because there's just something about narcissism that we innately react against, and none of us would like to think that we're narcissistic in any way. And a narcissist, really, the world revolves around them, and everyone in their orbit is there to enhance their life and help them accomplish their goals. So a narcissist just tends to use people for their own benefit, and when they're done or where they're no longer filling the role that the narcissist needs, they just quickly discard them and move on. And so you see that an awful lot, even on church staffs, where the euphemism we use in church leadership is you're just no longer a fit. It's
Mhm.
not like you've done anything wrong. It's just that you're no longer serving that leader's purpose. You're not on board, or you have a dissenting view somehow. And so the narcissist just can't live with that.
Sure. Now,
And so,
well, yeah. Now let's kind of carry that over the principles anyway, and say in a family of origin context and scenario, to kind of help us. Not everybody watching has been on church staff,
right.
but for those who have been on any staff in a workplace, but also in a family setting as well, how would you recommend observing and seeing and what's going on there?
Yeah, it can be a complicated process, particularly in the midst of the family of origin. So if you're always a part of that family system, even as you grow up and become independent.
Right.
But I think it's just important to see and to recognize when a person is always right,
Mm.
when there's never any discussion. A narcissist begins to create their own false reality. Just like they create this false self, this persona, they create their own lies and actually believe it to be reality. So, for example, I've known leaders and other people who will say that their church is one of the biggest in this state or whatever. But if you really look at the statistics, it's really not. But somehow, in their mind, they've created this reality that it's one of the biggest, most effective churches, and maybe they're counting everyone who's ever come and who's long lost on the road or whatever it is. But again, you're in the shadow of a narcissist when everything is just always about them, and they see everything through the lens of how it impacts them, how it makes them look, how it affects them. And oftentimes narcissists have very little empathy for anyone else. They can't really relate to your pain because it's not about them. So it really doesn't concern them.
Sure.
Um, you know, and so then there's the compulsive dark side. And at the root of the compulsive dark side, as you mentioned, it manifests itself in control. And oftentimes compulsives are the workaholics, the perfectionists. And they always use, the catchphrase for their perfectionism as excellence. God calls us to excellence. And that's kind of an excuse for their perfectionism. But oftentimes at the root of the compulsive is anger. It's repressed anger that they couldn't control in childhood, that they didn't know what to do with, and so they bottle it up. And what happens for the compulsive is they begin trying to control everything else in their life that they can control. They couldn't control the anger. They didn't have an outlet for it. They couldn't properly express it and have a receptive, person to receive that and walk them through that anger. And so what happens, even as young children, is we begin to bottle that up and we realize we can't control this situation, but we're going to control everything else we can. And we're going to become as perfect as we possibly can. And compulsives are often, the achievers. They're the ones that are always, perfect. They dress perfect. Their hair is always perfect. Everything's in order. And you can just see a compulsive oftentimes coming a mile away, because everything is in control. And then, of course, we all know about the codependent. The codependent is someone who obviously has become dependent on someone else's dependency or some system in their family. Oftentimes they come from families where there's a dependency on alcohol or maybe even food addiction or a really strict religious system or moral code. And so they become dependent on that and create this reality where they're always the peacemakers. They're always keeping the peace, trying to keep balance in the family or the work system or whatever. But yet at the same time, it's very frustrating for them. They just want to be able to say no. But one of the hallmarks of a codependent is they can never say no. And, oftentimes we learn very quick who the codependents are in our network of friends because they're always the go-to person. Oh, Mike couldn't do it, but Don, he'll do it. He always says yes.
No problem.
And then Don says yes, but then he goes home and kicks the cat and says, I can't believe they asked me to do that. I'm so overloaded. Well, why didn't you just say no? But the codependent can't because that's the persona that they've created to kind of, again, compensate for their own inner brokenness and wounds that they haven't really dealt with.
Sure. And what you're describing is if I say yes to everybody, I can then please everybody and be fulfilled.
Except for the one person you're not pleasing is yourself.
Yeah.
Exactly. And obviously life is not about just pleasing yourself, but that can become an unhealthy kind of dynamic in a person's life when you're always living to please other and keep the peace because we live in a broken world and you can never keep the peace completely. There are always going to be times when you're going to disappoint someone and that's okay. It's okay. One of the things I talk to codependents about is don't take that monkey on your back. That's not your monkey. You've got plenty of your own to deal with, and so oftentimes just for our own emotional, mental, spiritual health, we have to say no. We have to establish boundaries and not allow others to impose their desires and their wants on us. So
how true. And the paranoia person, I mean, that comes out as a dominant and depending on where the person's at and the levels and
right
inventory, but describe again the fear, paranoia.
I mean, paranoia is the deep root of a paranoid false self is someone who's been deeply disappointed by others. They lack trust of others. They think others are always out kind of to hurt them or undermine them. And so the way that often manifests in our adult life, in work or in leadership, is we're always wondering if people are out to get us. We see two people talking in the corner or two board members talking among themselves, and I wonder if they're talking about me. I wonder if they're not happy with me. That's also a problem that compulsives face is because appearance is so important to them and making sure that a performance is acceptable. But for the paranoid person, they really struggle to trust others, because obviously if you're in a deep, meaningful relationship with someone, then that person has the possibility of hurting you and betraying you.
Mm-hmm.
So oftentimes paranoid people keep others at arm's length.
Mm-hmm.
They can't experience intimacy, not physical intimacy, but emotional and spiritual intimacy with others, because they're afraid if they're authentic and are transparent and share who they really are, it will be used against them to undermine them. And so, they constantly live in fear of kind of people undermining them. And then there's the passive aggressive.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that has been thrown around a lot. I've heard, again, in many circles lately in the past few years. Oh, they're passive aggressive. Oh, this, oh, that. And, oh, I could just see it. And all those expressions. But let's unpack passive aggressive for what it really is.
Yeah, well, passive aggressive obviously is someone who is aggressive in a passive way. Mm-hmm. So they don't feel comfortable sharing their true feelings and what they really think with someone, but they'll tell them to their face, no, you didn't hurt me. No, I'm okay. I'm not upset. And then they'll go to a third party and triangulate and say what this person did and how dare they. And then if the person even comes back to the passive aggressive and says, hey, I understand that I really did hurt. Oh, no, I'm not hurt. No problem, And working with a passive aggressive person in relationship is kind of like trying to get Jello on a fork, It just keeps slipping off. You think that you've got understanding and that everything's okay, and then you find out again a week later that no, everything's not okay. Mm. And for the passive aggressive person, again, really the root of that is someone, who's been deeply hurt, who's never been able to measure up to oftentimes their own standard, or maybe a standard that their family set for them or something. And they've never been able to tell the truth about how they feel, about what they're struggling with. And so they've just kind of learned to bottle up their frustration and anger and never share it directly, but always kind of go around talking to others about it. But then when they're confronted with it, everything's okay, no problem. And so that's a very challenging personality type, a shadow side to work with.
Sure is. In fact, I appreciate in the book how you talk about Job being the reluctant, or not Job, sorry, Jonah.
Yeah.
The reluctant complainer.
Yeah.
And how Jonah, now why don't those people, just die and God strike them down and they repented? Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And but that does illustrate it well.
But I think the key for all of this related to recovery and to the 12 steps is all of these different manifestations have deep roots in wounds and scars that we've experienced during the course of our life, and they're so painful that we can't really even go there ourselves. And so what we do to protect ourselves is we project these different personas, or we create this persona that's often manifested in one of these or more. And what we need to understand with the dark side, for those of you who are familiar with spiritual gifts, if you know anything about spiritual gifts, they often cluster together. Mm-hmm. So if you have the gift of leadership, you often have the gift of exhortation, or some other type of leadership gift. If you have the gift of leadership, you don't often have the gift of mercy or service. But if you have the gift of helps, then you often have the gifts of service and mercy as well. So they kind of cluster together. And the same is true with the dark side. Oftentimes, if you're a narcissist, the most frequent kind of companion to narcissism is compulsive. And you'll notice that most narcissists are also very in control, always, well-dressed, well-groomed, all of that. They've always got their world completely together, Yes. And oftentimes if you're passive-aggressive, you can also be paranoid. And then codependent can kind of slip in with all of the different, groupings. It's one of those real common traits that we pick up as a result of just the brokenness of our family of origin and that kind of thing. But again, the key is it's not necessarily the dark side that we need to deal with. It's the pain and the scars and the wounds inside that caused us to create that false self in the first place, to kind of compensate for the weakness, the brokenness, the inadequacy, the shame that we feel in our lives.
Yeah, I hear you saying, get to the root,
Yeah.
get to the source of what has then produced the dark side that's been dominating. But also, too, when you take the profile, everybody, as you go to the website that Sam gave you, and or you go to it in the book, it helps to see where you're at, because things will shift.
Yeah.
We all have five of them, all five
Right.
going on in all of us. But what Dr. Rima has helped us to understand is that they all will be at different levels depending on the seasons of our lives.
Yeah. And they'll remain relatively constant throughout our life until we learn about what our dark side is, and then begin to deal with the root causes and grow through that. And again, the primary way that we do that is through self-awareness and self-knowledge, and begin learning about ourselves and dealing with those issues. And in the book, the entire third part of the book is about, how do we overcome our dark side? Once we know what it is, and we're willing to admit that, yes, this is an issue in my life, this is an issue in my leadership and relationships, and it's creating friction in my life and my relationships with others, then we need to begin to explore, so why have I created this particular false self? Why have I decided that I need to compensate? What am I compensating for?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the best books that I can recommend, just as an overall book in dealing with your dark side, is David Benner's book, Surrender to Love. And he has another book called The Gift of Being Yourself. And I think for all of us, it's very, very challenging to go back and understand some of the experiences maybe we had in childhood, during our development years, that left some of those, what I call missing blocks on our pyramid of needs.
Yes.
That we end up compensating for. And so once we begin to understand where that comes from, we can begin to deal with it. But the reality is, the only real solution is surrendering to the love of God and recognizing that in ourselves, we will never be adequate. I really don't like when people use the phrase today that's very popular, you're enough, because the reality is we're not enough, but we're enough in Christ.
Yeah.
When we surrender to Christ, then he becomes enough for us, and he doesn't compensate for our weaknesses and our wounds and our shame. He takes it away, and he begins the process at least to where we can begin to grow and heal and become more whole as individuals and begin living out of the true self that he created us to be. And I think the only way that can happen, the only way we can begin to admit some of these, inner issues, is when we are confident that we are loved unconditionally just as we are. When we have the safety of knowing that God is not going to turn on us. God loved us while we were his enemies. When we were completely distant from God, he loved us so much, as we know, that Christ died for us. And when we recognize there's nothing that we can do to lose the love of God, and what he really wants is our honesty. He wants an intimate relationship with us, but you can only have an intimate relationship with your true self and another self, not your false self.
Sure. And that also involves taking responsibility for those sources, that pain and so on, which of course, that's the 12 steps help us to do too. It's
Right.
almost where the 12 steps become the roadmap or the framework to facilitate and take responsibility for our stuff and our inner pain. And also then to be able to recognize, and it all comes together in that way. And that's where Jesus is enough.
Yeah. And I think that's why the 12 steps, reference God so much. And I know that they've been adapted to say God is you understand him or whatever. And I understand that, the higher power. But for me and for those who are Christian, it's the personal God that's manifested in Jesus Christ and that we experience through the Holy Spirit who indwells us. And so, yeah, it's a hard process, and some people never are willing to take the journey. And you see people in their 70s that are still acting out of their narcissistic false self, and everyone around them, it's just glaring. But the person themselves just can't see it and refuse to admit it. Because to admit it is to admit to their deepest fear, their deepest shame, which is just not acceptable to them, So it is a constant challenge, but it's a journey worth taking when we can finally, recognize. And here's the reality is 10 people could experience the same kind of traumatic event in childhood, and all 10 people will respond to that differently. So it's not necessarily what happens to us, but it's how we respond to what happens to us that begins to create this false self and how we feel like we need to protect ourselves. And when I do workshops, I give all kinds of examples of this from my own life and how I respond to different things in my childhood and my adolescence that created this, this false self of an achiever, of a performer, of a compulsive who has to be in control of everything, and to appear perfect. And that's why the root sin for the achiever is deception, because I know I'm not perfect, but I'm going to put out this persona and deceive everyone. Even when I'm feeling miserable, I'm not going to admit that this is a problem.
How true. And it all goes back to how we've been raised, and again, mom and dad, and you're right, how we respond or how we responded as a child. But of course, and then we can get a whole another discussion about fathers and mothers and parenting.
And again, we live in a broken world. Even those of us who grew up in Christian homes, they weren't perfect.
No.
Our parents weren't perfect. They brought all their brokenness into their relationship and created a family. And even though they loved us, and cared for us, because they're not perfect, they have an impact on our lives, just like we're having an impact on the lives of our children. The expectations that we have, the things that we demand of them, and so it is a constant learning journey. But there's this, I don't know if you've heard of, the double knowledge that Augustine talks about. Augustine talks about this upward spiral of knowledge. And it begins with first our understanding of God as a God who loves us. And it's in the safety of that understanding that we can then begin to know ourselves more deeply and really explore those areas of brokenness and those wounds. And the more we understand ourselves and our brokenness, the more we understand God and appreciate his grace and his mercy. And we begin this upward spiral of the more we know God, then the more we're willing to know ourselves, and the deeper we're willing to go, which enables us to know God more. And it's just this constantly growing relationship of kind of God's revealing to us who we truly are if we're willing to accept it. And it's really the process of sanctification.
Yeah, exactly right. And so translating it into 12-step speak, it's where you hit bottom and all you can do is look up.
Yeah.
And that's the spiral back up, because that's where you're dealing with all your stuff. And especially step 4, dealing with our resentments, dealing with our pain, dealing with our part in it, aside from abuse. And then of course, admitting all of it, confessing it. And then of course, the prayers.
Yeah. When it comes to the dark side and the false self, what we say is, we all come to a point where we face a crisis of limitation, where what was once working for us and the persona that we created, what was once working is no longer working. And we begin to recognize that we've kind of come to this place of limitation. And then we have 3 different options. We can either deny it, and we can become what is often called the fool, the old fool, if we persist in it long enough. And we see people like that who are chronologically old, but emotionally and spiritually still in an infancy stage, because they've refused to face their crisis of limitations. They just constantly keep doing the same thing, trying to do better. The other path that we can take is to become the embittered fool, where we begin to blame others and say it's everyone else's fault and I've been wronged and I've never been given a fair shot and, all of that. And then if we persist in that, we become the embittered fool. But if we begin to take the downward journey to begin to really explore our dark side and begin to admit the things that we struggle with, then we become the wise fool. We become a fool in Christ. True. And then we're not living with pretension. We can be our true self. We're not concerned with what others think about us. I mean, for many people, every day of their life is lived under this pressure of what do they think? What do they think about me? How am I measuring up? Am I okay? But when you can, let go of all of that and just be who God made you to be. And you don't have to please everyone. You don't have to be the greatest. You don't have to be the best, the most successful. You can just be you. And there's incredible freedom in that,
Precisely. Freedom and also becoming. And I talk a lot about that too, where it's not about success, but it's about significance.
Yeah.
And what Christ has imbued upon us. Well, we're running out of time.
Okay.
Because
it's been fun.
I know you got to get to another meeting.
Yeah.
But I want us to hear from you, Dr. Rima, a word of encouragement in looking at our dark sides, coming from God's word and the power of Christ and hope that we have today.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think I would just encourage everyone, if you haven't, to kind of take the profile, particularly if you're experiencing friction in your life, in your relationships, in your leadership, and you recognize that all is not well. Just begin, take it, be open and honest about that. And then one of my favorite passages in scriptures is in 2 Corinthians chapter 12.
Yeah.
Where Paul talks about that it's in his weakness that the power of Christ is perfected. And we've always been taught that it's in our strengths, it's in our strength finder, it's in all of our great personality traits that the power of Christ is perfected and that we can be successful and make a difference. But what Paul recognized was really, it was, in his weakness. And it's not just in our weakness, but in our recognition of our weakness and owning our brokenness. And that when we do that and we give it to God and allow him to begin his deep redeeming and restoring process, the power of Christ is perfected and manifested in people who live in that place, who recognize that Christ is enough and that it's okay to be broken, because we all are. And pretending that we're not only hurts ourselves and actually robs others of the person that God created us to be.
Absolutely. We are broken and beautiful in Jesus Christ.
Oh.
And thank you for watching, everybody. God bless you. As you move forward, God will give you the victory in getting through your dark sides and going back to those origins and again, knowing that Christ is enough for you. Thank you, Dr. Rima. God bless you, everybody. Thanks for getting a checkup with Dr. Mark today. And we will see you next week.